Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Phil Arno. When you watch the news on TV or listen to the radio, you might expect that you are being kept up to date on the local stories that affect you directly, as in your pocketbook. Now, I'm not talking about inflation, although that does affect every one of us. No, I'm talking about something a little more direct. Do you pay taxes in Western New York? How about a school tax? Well, I live in Clarence, and believe me, I pay school taxes, a lot of school taxes. Well, the story you haven't heard on any TV station, radio station, or seen in the newspapers is that you, my friends, may, for the lack of a better way to put it, have been ripped off for a number of years now, right in the town of Clarence. How about to the tune of $200 for every man, woman, and child in the town, collected from you that wasn't needed? Outrageous, you say. How can you say that on TV and get away with it? Well, actually, it's not me, folks. The Office of State Controller in Albany has filed reports for a number of years now, right there in black and white, saying that in violation of the law, the Clarence School Board has hidden surplus funds illegally from the public, all the while asking for increases in the school tax, claiming that they need more money. And it's not just Clarence. Williamsville is 4 times as bad as Clarence. It's right there in black and white. Go to the Office of State Controller and take a look. Now, with me to talk about this is Cybil Robbins, who has run for a seat on the school board in Clarence and is running again this year for a seat. So, welcome to the show, Cybil. When you are spending other people's money, sometimes it doesn't go so well for the people you're spending their money. So, the Clarence School District, this is not just a one-year problem. The state audit that takes place, from the Department of the Comptroller has found over the years that pretty consistently the school board in Clarence has kind of underestimated or overestimated, costs and the budget and whatever. But what it boils down to is they ask for tax increases every year, when in effect they've got more money than they admit. And that's not really technically legal, right?
Well, it's not technically legal when you're over the 4% of the budgeted allowance. And once you're over the 4%, that's in violation of a New York State real property tax law 1318.
No, we're not talking about taking money away from kids or cutting programs. What we're talking about is they already have enough money, and more money than their budget calls for. And yet they're not admitting that. They're basically saying, they've got maybe $4 or $5 or $6 million more than they need, and they're kind of squirreling that away, for lack of a better way to put it. And this is what this is not me saying this is the state controller saying this. And they're putting it away, which is in violation of a written law in New York State. And they're ignoring that law. They're putting this money away that they have, and then they're turning to the voters and they're saying, we need to increase your taxes, because if we don't get more taxes out of you, we may cut back on art classes, or we may take away some of the athletic programs. And that, to me, now correct me if I'm wrong, but that seems to be disingenuous.
Well, they're proposing a budget, and it does include all the extracurriculars for the kids, which I believe are extremely important, that the children have a broad base of knowledge and to understand what their likes are. What they are doing and being disingenuous about is that for the budgeted years that were examined during the audit, there are approximately $5.3 million that are unaccounted for in terms of being over the 4% allowance within the budget. So it's not being transparent with the taxpayer to say, hey, I didn't spend all the money. We have this much left over from the year's prior budget, and now I'm going to ask you to vote on a budget again, but we have leftover money, and this is how much we had left over.
They're leaving
So
that part out.
they're leaving that part out, the transparency part of how much money do you really have within the district, and having a conversation about that.
But let me get this straight. They're not only leaving out the part that they have more money in reserves, they're asking the voters for increases in taxes. Because I live in Clarence, and I know they're asking for more money every year. They're not saying we have enough and we'll go with last year's budget. Secretly, we have more than enough. They're saying we need more, even though they've got an excess. They've got, a surplus.
Yes, they are carrying an excess of 4%, and they're not telling the taxpayer, you and I, we're residents of Clarence, that I have more than 4%.
Well, to put this into real numbers, we have about, between 4,000 and 5,000 kids in the school system in Clarence. And we're talking $4 and $6 million that they have in excess of what they use. The difference in the budgetary numbers is as much as $13.7 million between what they've said and what they actually, use. But even if it's $5 or $6 million, I did the math, and it comes out to about $200 for every man, woman, and child in the town of Clarence. Every man, woman, and child. So if you have a family of 5, that's $1,000 that they're taking away from your family for school taxes that they actually didn't need this year because they have more than enough to take care of it.
Yes, they do.
So $1,000 for a family of 5. If you're kind of struggling in this economy with the inflation and the gas prices and the price of eggs and everything else, you could use that extra $1,000 to keep your family kind of insured or to pay the utilities or whatever. That's pretty tough when you see those board members with a straight face say, we need more.
Absolutely. I mean, I can't tell you how many taxpayers I've spoken to as part of the campaign, and they have told me that they're suddenly out of a job. They haven't been working since Thanksgiving. And yes, they said, yeah, we're in rough shape right now.
Now, I'm going to reach out to the people who are running for the board now and possibly the people who are on the board to get their take on this. So, we want to give equal time, and we want to have everybody's side. But I have heard that if you ask what the explanation is, one of the responses, and I haven't heard this personally, but one of the things I've heard is, one of the responses is, well, look at Williamsville. They're worse than us. They've held back $47 million in surplus for a school district that has 9,000 kids, but $47 million versus us, and at most it's 13.7 million for Clarence, and that's like saying, well, Williamsville robbed a big bank. We only robbed a small bank. I mean, that doesn't make sense to me. It just doesn't make sense. There's no explanation that justifies this.
It's what we need is transparency. We need to know at the end of the year what was spent, what was left over, what's going in the general fund. And they are creating budgets for the following year. What is that money going to go to? And as taxpayers that right now that are hurting, I know a lot of taxpayers would like to see their school bill reduced to not feel, the pressure of paying bills.
Well, this is not just something that happened last year.
Yes.
It's been going on for several years.
Yes.
And we don't hear much about it. This is the first I've heard about it, but it's something that is official. It's not something we're just kind of dreaming up. The Office of Comptroller in New York State in Albany has officially came out with this.
Yes.
Where's the accountability? I mean, years past, this whole thing has existed. but there's been no correction. What's going on?
I'm not really certain why there isn't a corrective action and more transparency to the voters, to the taxpayers. Maybe we need to have a difference in terms of what is literally reported to the taxpayer, because we're not aware of what is in the general fund. Like if I were to go to a board meeting right now, I am not 100% certain what's in the general fund and what's in the other accounts.
I have a question. For the capital reserve, has it been decided, or when do you decide how much we would put in there, or how does the board, when does that process? We've never done this before.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Usually what would happen with schools is that you would have a spending plan approved for the following year. You would go through that year and if everything works out as planned, there will be funds left over at the end of the year.
Yep.
And then Dr. Grupka would make a recommendation to the board in terms of where those leftover funds would go. So as we end this school year and begin the next, Dr. Grupka would have a recommendation in terms
Yes.
of those leftover funds at the end of the year, what reserves they would go into.
Yes. In the June budget, we would look at creating reserves like we did last year, and I would make a recommendation for how much would go into that fund. It does not need to be funded all at once, and it likely will not be, but that's why it's over 15 years.
Well, this is technically a violation of New York state law. It's there in black and white. There's been no accountability. Nobody's been penalized at all. The district hasn't been penalized.
No.
Is there any recourse that you know of that, the voters in Clarence, the taxpayers in Clarence might have? I mean, what can be done with this?
There's nothing written into law to say here is the consequence. So what the district did do is they actually prepared an action plan where they put some of the money into reserve funds. And that's what they did. They put them in reserve funds. And one of them was for an insurance reserve fund, which we do have a stopgap insurance policy for. And the district, I believe, from what I can see in the budget notes, that's a very expensive policy for a stopgap insurance policy.
Well, we're out of time for this segment, but my question is, when was the last time you heard of a government official thinking about giving money back to the taxpayer? Think about that. And after these messages, we'll come back and we'll dwell on that. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Big Picture. My guest is Cybil Robbins, who I have to say is running for school board in the town of Clarence. This election is upcoming, and we will be reaching out to the other candidates who are running for a position on the school board, and we'll also reach out to the people on the school board who are not running in this election to see what they have to say about what we've been talking about and what we will be talking about in this program. We want to give equal time. We want to see what the other sides of the discussion have to say. Equal time. But one thing that is not in question is the audit that is in, anybody can take a look at it. It's public domain. The audit from the comptroller's office in New York State. All you have to do is go to the auditor's website and the controller's website and look at it. It will tell you how much has been put away illegally by the school board in Clarence or Williamsville, for that matter. And I haven't looked at the other school districts, and I have a very sneaking suspicion that the other school districts do this as a matter of course as well. So we're not trying to single out just Clarence or Williamsville, but that's what we're talking about right now. Now, that being said, you did run for the school board in the last election. What was that like? What was that election? What kind of experience did you have? That's the first time you've run for anything, right?
That was the first time I ran for anything. And it was great listening to the concerns of the taxpayers, the ones that had their children in the school district, as well as the grandparents. And they were concerned about, what was being taught in the schools.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of experience was it running? I mean, did you have an experience where you thought everything played out fairly, or was it a situation where you couldn't get your message out the way you wanted it to, or things were said that you didn't intend your message to be interpreted the way it came out, or people said it came out?
Well, as part of running for school board, I was taking a look at the expenditures of the district, and I did notice a discrepancy, and I did think it was the school board was overspending. What I learned later on, and it was confirmed also in this report, is that they were literally taking money from one school year and bringing it forward to the following school year. And the auditors had a problem with that, the way it wasn't expended in the prior year. So it was essentially like carrying over all this extra money. And one of the things that they were doing was they were budgeting over the 3 years. I believe the number was about $180,000 for technology. And so they go, oh, we have extra money. I'm going to spend all this extra money on technology because we have extra money. So they spent over $3 million on putting it into technology versus budgeting it ahead of time.
They budgeted it for 100 and some, but they spent $3 million?
Yes, they budgeted roughly $180,000 according to the audit report, and then they spent over $3 million on technology. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, I once did a story with a narcotics squad, and I'm not going to say what agency it was, but it was towards the end of their fiscal year. And the narcotics detectives, we went out overnight and we were, doing a patrol, and they did a raid and so on. And one of the things behind the scenes that the narcotics detectives kind of admitted to me, and this wasn't for the air, but they admitted that they had a budget. Mm-hmm. And the way government works is if they didn't spend all the money that they had in their budget, then the following year, their budget would be reduced, because the assumption is, well, they didn't spend it all. That means they must not need it. Mm-hmm. And the mentality was, well, we may not have spent it this year, but next year we might need that money, so we better not have a surplus. So at the last minute, they're out there on the streets giving out $100 bills to, their informants and stuff, just so that they could get rid of the money in the budget, mm-hmm. so that they wouldn't be shorted out the next year and have their budget reduced. And I'm thinking that this is a little bit like that mentality, that the school board has a budget, and if they don't spend it all, they're worried that next year, they'll say, well, gee, you guys were really efficient. You don't need as much money. And heaven forbid that we don't get as much mm-hmm. money next year. Is that what goes through their minds?
Well, in this case, the audit report mentioned about an average over those 3 years. They roughly didn't spend about $5.3 million. So they made a choice to carry some of that money over to the following year for some expenditures that they had.
Which is not legally permissible. That's not the way it's supposed to work.
That's not the way the budget is supposed to work.
It's especially not supposed to work that they had it and then they go to the public and say, we're short and we need more money. Mm-hmm. That's really, I mean, if the taxpayers, if they were to tell the taxpayers, you know what, we've got extra money, more money than we spend, but you know what, we're going to ask you for more taxes anyway, just because we can. And mm-hmm. if we don't get that more money, we're going to threaten to take away from your kids, not reading, writing, and arithmetic, but art classes
yes.
and athletic programs
yes.
and the things that your kids really like a lot and really makes them well-rounded.
Well, it's about putting together a reasonable budget so that that you're going to meet it. It's not about having it how many percentage points over. It's about putting together reasonable budgets. I believe in multi-year budgeting. So for example, if you have capital costs that you know that you have for the whole school, maybe the longest one is 30-year replacement. We should have long-term capital plans out there so that you know where your replacement costs are coming with capital. You know where you might have to do some upkeep on things. Long-term planning, so you know what the expectations are from year to year, and then you have what's built in there for what you need on the regular basis. You can put in realistic budgets. And that was the expectation of also within this audit report is, realistic budgeting for what's really necessary.
I'm trying to be fair here, and I'm trying not to make this sound worse than it is. But if you read the auditor's report, and you just basically go by the black and white and what it is, you can't help but say there's something wrong here. This should not be. And I'd love to hear the explanation of the school board, and I'd love to hear the justification. But right now, in this discussion, and reading the report, and knowing that it's been ongoing, and knowing about Williamsville as well, it's hard for me to not lump this into things that I've seen over the last 40 years doing news and journalism. And that is that government and government officials tend to try to complicate things and use the people's money to their advantage just because they can.
Well, I'd like to give you an example. So during the last meeting for the Board of Education, a discussion took place was if we got more tax money from New York State, because at the time of that meeting, the budget was not finalized, what were they going to do with the extra money that they received from New York State?
Have to have the budget approved for us 7 days prior to vote, which does not give us a lot of time to turn around a budget. That being said, most districts are moving forward with the plan as it is right now. Hopefully, they'll settle this sooner rather than later. We can always meet again to amend a budget if we had to. I don't think there's discrepancy on the educational piece of this budget, so I'm hoping there won't be changes. And it doesn't look like there's going to be.
From a community member's perspective, you had mentioned we're going forward with a budget of just over 93 million. So that's what we're asking for. So likely, if the state were to somehow reallocate additional funds, we wouldn't then spend more than 93 million. If we would make a decision relative to reducing our fund balance we're allotting into the budget. And
correct.
Conversely, if for some reason they reduce funding, we cannot go over 93 million. So we have to either determine where we're going to find additional funds internally to still spend the 93. Is that correct?
We could decide to cut the budget if they cut funds. Although I have to be honest, I don't think that's going to happen. At this point, though, yes, if we got additional funds, we would probably reduce the fund balance.
They said that they would return the money to the general fund, and
Not to the taxpayers.
not to the taxpayer, but to the general fund.
The general fund for the town.
Yes.
Okay.
So my question was, when I was waiting for a response from somebody on the board to say, could we reduce the tax levy and give that back to the taxpayer?
And we're not talking about taking a check and mailing it out to the people in the town.
No.
We're talking about saying to the people in the town, you know what? We're not going to collect or take as much of your money this year as we did last year. We're still going to take some of your money. We're just not going to take as much of your money. That's the mentality is like, we're giving money back to them. No, you're taking less of their money. You're not giving them anything. You're just taking less.
Taking less.
So that's the way government people think. Well, we're giving the taxpayer something. No, you're not. You're taking less from the taxpayer
And it's
under those
always been our money too, right? It's always been our money.
Yeah, and that's, it's hard to believe because these people, government officials are people. They're humans. And when, I don't know what happens, but when you become a government official, somehow you sign on to this mentality that, okay, now we have this ability, this permission to think a little bit differently. Now the money that we have doesn't belong to the people. It belongs to us, and we need to wisely, according to our rules, decide what happens with it. And that's, it's almost like an us versus them thing, and it shouldn't be. It should be us. It should be we, everybody, for the better of the community.
One thing I would love to see, being a member of the board, would be to allow people to ask questions after all the discussions take place and not have to sign up ahead of time. Because if you're attending a board meeting and they're having a conversation, you don't know if you're going to have a question or not before the meeting. It would be great, for example, in the case where they're having the discussion, if we got more money from New York State government, where I could have asked the question, do you think we could have lowered the tax levy this year? And have a response.
Okay, I want to thank Cybil Robbins for being my guest on this show. It's amazing the mentality that goes through the head of officials once they become officials. Anyway, this is an important subject, and I urge you to go to the Office of State Controller and read. And we urge the people on the school board in Clarence, running for the school board, and in Williamsville as well, to come on to the show and give your side of the story. Equal time. You're more than welcome to come on this show and talk about what we've just talked about on this big picture. So I want to thank you for watching The Big Picture. As always, thank you for watching WBBZ-TV. We really appreciate it. And we try to be objective here. We try to just tell you what you may not hear on some of the other stations. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time on The Big Picture.